All right, great. So we're going to talk about college financial aid and paying for college. It's going to be hopefully interesting and definitely will have quite a bit of stuff. So if you're thinking about college for your kids, there's a good chance that you have encountered all kinds of college related clickbait on the internet. And I think about college all the time. And so I see this clickbait all the time. And I can tend to be kind of a sucker for it. And these are the kinds of colleges that show up when you see what are the best value colleges. Unfortunately, like most clickbait, these types of internet pages really are not going to be very helpful for you. And the reason is that these types of articles know nothing about your student or your resources. And so none of these colleges are going to be of value for you if the way that they set prices doesn't match your student's profile in terms of eligibility for different kinds of aid. So we're going to talk about that in quite a bit of detail. So the basic agenda tonight is assessing where you might get aid. And when I say you, what I really mean is your student, and then deciding what you can afford. And in that case, the you really is referring to the parents or the whole family. So assessing where you might get aid is a matter of identifying the student's profile in terms of eligibility for two types of aid. One is need-based aid, that's based on family income and assets. The other is merit-based aid, that's based on the student's academic profile, grades, and so on. In order to get aid, you need to match the college that your student is going to or applying to needs to have an aid awarding policy that matches the profile of your student. So for example, if you have no financial need and you're applying only to colleges that award solely on the basis of need, you're going to be paying the list price at every single one of those colleges. So that's kind of the thrust of what we're going to be talking about. Deciding what you can afford is making sure that you understand the true total cost of a degree. You need to understand the resources that you have available to pay the cost, and that's typically going to be savings and income. If savings and income isn't enough, you'll need to think about how much you might have to borrow, and then really important, deciding whether any borrowing that you might think about to pay for college is going to be reasonable. So I understand that there are people from different parts of the country on this call. I'm from Maine, and so the examples of public colleges that I'm going to give for the most part are Maine colleges. So whenever I talk about University of Maine, you can substitute your in-state public college. So when most people think about the cost of college, they focus on the sticker price. So at USM, the University of Southern Maine, that's about $24,000 a year. At the University of New England, it's $58,000. Bowdoin is $72,000, and Boston College is $79,000. But it turns out that colleges award a significant amount of gift aid, that's financial aid that you don't need to pay back, and that lowers the true cost for students who receive that aid. So at USM, they award about $13,000 in gift aid on average to students who receive gift aid. University of New England awards about $22,000, Bowdoin $45,000, and Boston College $48,000. So that means that for the students who are receiving aid at USM, the net price is $9,800. At UNE, it's $36,000. Bowdoin is $27,000, and Boston College is $30,000. However, not every student receives financial aid. Not every student receives gift aid. And that is an important distinction. So at Bowdoin, 46% of the students are paying that full sticker price of $72,000. Only 54% of them are receiving gift aid. At Boston College, only about 39% receive gift aid. 61% are paying that full $78,000 a year. When you factor that into the true net price, the true average net price for all students, it turns out that USM is about $11,000 a year, UNE is $36,000, Bowdoin is $47,000, and Boston College is $57,000. So the takeaway from this is it really doesn't matter what colleges charge. What matters is what you pay. And what you pay is going to be your net price. That's the college's cost of attendance minus your gift aid. And just as airlines charge different prices for every seat on the plane, it's quite possible that everyone at a given college might be paying a different price after gift aid. So let's talk about the types of financial aid. And there are two main categories. The first one is gift aid. This is free money that the college awards and does not need to be repaid. If it's based on financial need, it's typically called grants. And if it's based on academic criteria, it's typically called merit aid or scholarships. Now, this gift aid truly reduces the cost of college. The other category of financial aid is called self-help. And this is work study, a job that the student gets during the academic year, or money that you borrow to pay the cost of college and then have to repay with interest after college. This type of aid does not reduce the cost of college. It helps you manage the cost, but it still doesn't impact that net price. So when you think about it this way, it's pretty clear that gift aid is better than self-help. Unfortunately, colleges don't make it easy all the time to figure it out. So if you look at this award letter, an award letter is the document that colleges use. Usually they send it by email or they'll put it on a portal that advises you of how much financial aid you're going to get. And this award letter says that it's $22,000. That's great. That's a lot of money. But when you look at the items on the award letter in detail, it turns out that 4 of the 7 lines are gift aid, 2 of the lines are loans, and 1 of them is work study. So when you distinguish those various types of aid and create the subtotals, the gift aid is a little under $15,000, the loans are $5,500, and work study is $1,800. Now, $15,000 is still a lot of money, but it's a lot less than $22,000. And there's some important information missing. What's the starting cost? And what's your true net price after gift aid? So I went online for this college and I looked up, and the starting cost is a little under $50,000. When you subtract about $15,000 in gift aid, the net price for this student for 1 year at this college is $34,865. So keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that number later in the session. First, though, let's talk about gift aid in a little bit more detail. So we said there are 2 types. One's based on financial need, and that's typically called grants. The drivers of that are family income and assets. You apply for this type of gift aid and for federal student loans at all U.S. colleges using the FAFSA. In addition to the FAFSA, there's a supplemental application required for college-funded gift aid at about 140 colleges. That's called the CSS Profile. Now, that's a minority of colleges, but they tend to be the ones that are the most generous with need-based aid, and they tend to be the higher profile colleges. So there's a good chance that you're going to encounter the profile as your student is going through the college process. The other type of gift aid is merit aid or scholarships. And this is typically based on things like grades, test scores, class rank. Now, this is often awarded automatically without any separate application. So when the college advises your student that he or she has been admitted, they will typically say, in addition to being admitted, we want to offer you a scholarship of X. Even though it's often accompanying that admission letter, you always want to double check on college websites to make sure there are no types of scholarships that do require additional applications. You want to make sure that you set yourself up so that you can qualify for as much of this gift aid as possible when your student is going to college. So as your student is applying for admission, make sure that you are also checking the financial aid pages of each of the colleges that your student is applying to so that you can be sure you're in line to get the maximum amount of aid. So let's talk about need-based aid. This is what most people think of when they think about financial aid. This is the algebra portion of the evening. Need equals COA minus EFC. And I'm going to break those terms down in a second. But financial need in the college world has a very specific definition. And that definition is your maximum potential eligibility for need-based aid. It's not necessarily the amount of aid that you're going to get. It's the maximum amount of need-based aid that you might get at a given college. COA stands for cost of attendance, and it's always made up of 4 elements: tuition and fees, room and board, those are charges billed by the college, and then colleges will add allowances for what they estimate you're going to need for books for the various classes your student takes, and then also transportation and minimal additional miscellaneous expenses. EFC stands for expected family contribution. And this is one of the most misleading terms in the English language, because if you read that in English, it makes you think that that's what you're going to pay for college. In reality, most people don't pay the EFC. They might pay more, they might pay less, but it rarely turns out to be the EFC. And critically important, college aid policies vary, ranging from colleges that award no need-based aid to colleges who meet full financial need based on the FAFSA or the Profile EFC. Now, if you want to estimate your EFC, you can go to this website, plug in your financial information, and it's going to tell you what your EFC is. Knowing your EFC is helpful, but it's not sufficient. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you go to that website and you find out that your EFC is about $35,000. Well, that means that at the University of Maine, their cost of attendance at $26,000 is less than that. So you're not going to qualify for any need-based aid at the University of Maine. On the other hand, at Bowdoin, where the cost is roughly $75,000, you might qualify for as much as $40,000 in need-based aid at Bowdoin. Doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get that amount, but that's the maximum that you might qualify for. Another thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about need-based aid, every college defines its idea of need, and that is rarely the same as your idea of need. So we said that the EFC determines eligibility for need-based aid, and the way the arithmetic works, a lower EFC means more eligibility for need-based aid. So people often think, oh, gee, what can I do to lower my EFC and qualify for more aid? I'm going to talk about that in a second. There are actually 2 EFC formulas, one based on the FAFSA and one based on the Profile, but they both use the same basic approach, which is to look at the income and assets of the parents and the student. So there are actually 4 separate calculations going on in the background when the EFC is calculated. They add up the results for each of those subtotals, and that combined total of all of those 4 elements makes up the EFC. Now, here's why it's often difficult to have a significant impact on the EFC. It turns out that the parent portion from income is by far the most important part of that EFC calculation for most families. Once you reach a relatively low level of income, every additional dollar of income adds about 47 cents to the EFC. Now, most people are not in a position to quit their job for 4 years while their kid is in college. So for that reason, it's unlikely that you can have a big impact on that portion of the EFC that comes from income. Parent assets make up a much smaller portion of the EFC. So once you reach a relatively low level of assets, each additional dollar of assets adds about 5 or 5.5 cents to the EFC. So people often think, well, maybe I can shield some assets and qualify for more aid. In theory, that could be true. But the reality is that you've got to shield a whole lot of assets in order to make a significant difference in the amount of aid that you might qualify for. So if you shield $10,000 of assets, that's going to lower your EFC by maybe $500 or $560. That's good, but that really doesn't make that much of a difference when you're talking about a college that might cost $60,000, $70,000, or $80,000. Now, for most students in high school, the portion of the EFC from student income is insignificant. However, some students do have savings or assets in their own name. And in this case, that can be disadvantageous because student assets are assessed more heavily than parent assets. If a student has $10,000 in assets, those are going to add $2,000 to $2,500 to the EFC. If they were in the parent's name, they'd only add about $500 to the EFC. So there's a difference of $1,500 to $2,000 that you might save. And it turns out that there's actually a loophole that most people can take advantage of if they find that they have students with assets in their name. If you convert those assets into a student-owned 529 account, those will be counted as if they were a parent asset instead of a student asset. So that's a way to move them from the student portion of the EFC calculation into the parent portion and potentially reduce the EFC and qualify for a little bit more need-based aid. There are some special cases when the EFC is calculated it's pretty important to talk about. One of them is when there are multiple siblings in college at the same time. Historically, the parent portion of the EFC was shared among the siblings. And what that did is for each individual student, it could dramatically reduce the amount of the EFC, increasing eligibility for need-based aid. However, this is changing. Beginning next year, the FAFSA is going to eliminate that multiple sibling discount. Now, I expect that the CSS profile would continue to offer it, but we'll talk about the distinction between the FAFSA and the profile in a minute. Another special case is when your circumstances change, when your financial circumstances change. So when you fill out the FAFSA and the profile, you're filling out information about income that was earned in the past. However, it could be that your financial situation has changed. Maybe you've lost a job. Maybe there's been a death or divorce in the family. In any of those cases, what you need to do is to complete the FAFSA and the profile using the numbers that they're asking for, then send an email to each college that your student is applying to and say, hey, the information on my FAFSA and profile doesn't really reflect my current ability to pay for college. Here's what's happened. Can you consider giving me additional aid? They don't have to do that, but they typically will look at that and in many cases give you additional need-based aid if you might qualify. The third special case I want to talk about is when the parents are divorced or separated. And here the FAFSA and the profile have very different approaches. The FAFSA is going to look at the custodial parent only, and if that parent has remarried, they'll also look at the new spouse. The profile is going to look at both biological parents, and if those parents have remarried, they'll also be looking at the new spouses. So the profile could be looking at the income and assets of as many as 4 different parents when they're calculating that EFC. Now, there is a calculation that goes on in the background that's intended to put the primary responsibility for paying for college on the biological parents. However, that calculation is imperfect, and more often than not, in my experience, if the parents have remarried, it can be disadvantageous from a financial aid perspective. So if you're divorced, if you're thinking about getting remarried, do it for love, but don't do it for financial aid. So we said that the FAFSA and the profile are looking at income that was earned in the past. And I want to show you an example of how this works. This is an example for a student who is currently a junior in high school and is going to be graduating in the high school class of 2024. For the first year of college, the FAFSA and the profile are going to ask about income that was earned in 2022. So 2 years prior to 2024 when the student graduates from high school. Now that's the year that just ended this past December. You'll be filing your income taxes for that year by April 15th. Your student will be applying to college this fall. You'll file the FAFSA and the profile at about the same time that your student applies to college, and then the colleges will be able to give you an aid award at roughly the same time that they tell you whether your student has been admitted. So that's the way income works for the FAFSA and the profile. Assets are valued as of the date that you submit the form. So in the case of a high school junior, that's likely to be the fall of this year, the fall of 2023. And this presents another opportunity for planning that potentially could increase eligibility for aid by a little bit. If you have expenses that you know you need to make, it could be to your advantage to pay those bills prior to filling out the FAFSA and the profile. So a good example of this is someone who's self-employed and maybe pays estimated taxes. You might want to consider paying your estimated taxes before you fill out the FAFSA and the profile, even though that's earlier than they're due, because that will take them out of your bank account, and thus they won't be counted for financial aid. Now, this doesn't mean to go out and spend money for no good reason, but if you have expenses you know you need to make, that's something to consider. So this is a table that shows you the dates that are going to apply for financial aid for all 4 years of college for a current junior. So we said for the first year of college, they're going to be looking at 2022 income. The second year is going to look at 2023, third year, 2024, and the fourth will be 2025. Now, this presents another planning opportunity. It turns out that historically, payments from people other than the parents, so for example, a relative, a grandparent, a family friend who wants to help with college, those payments are counted as income to the student in the EFC calculation. Well, it turns out that the final income year that's going to be counted for the FAFSA and the profile is the year that ends when your student is a sophomore in college. So if that grandparent waits until after January 1st of the student's sophomore year of college to make those payments, the final income year for financial aid will have passed, and those payments will not affect eligibility for need-based aid after that point. Now, if it turns out that your student isn't going to be getting need-based aid, you don't need to worry about the timing of these payments from relatives. But if your student might qualify for need-based aid, this is something to keep in mind. So I'm not going to go through in detail, but if you ask for the slides, and you've got a table here that shows the years that will apply for sophomores and ninth graders. So I mentioned that the FAFSA is changing, and a critical question is whether the profile is going to change too. So let's talk about those changes. They're going to be effective for the 2024-2025 academic year, which means that students who are currently juniors in high school will be graduating in the spring of 2024 and entering college in the fall of 2024. Those students are going to have all of their college years based on the new FAFSA. Once this new FAFSA goes into effect, most income items are going to be coming directly from the IRS. That's going to make it easier in most cases for families to complete the form. So it's going to make it a little easier. It's not going to be quite as difficult for families. In addition, that term EFC, which I dislike so much, is going to be renamed the Student Aid Index, or SAI. Now, the arithmetic is going to be exactly the same. They're going to subtract the SAI from the cost of attendance. If that leaves a positive number, there is potential eligibility for need-based aid. But at least it's not going to be that inherently confusing term. If the parents are divorced, the definition of the custodial parent is going to be changing. So right now, the custodial parent is the parent with whom the student lives more than 50% of the time. Beginning for academic year 24-25, it's going to be the parent who contributed more of the student's expenses. This is one of the few changes to the FAFSA that's potentially making it a little bit more complicated. However, I think that in many cases, it's going to turn out that that custodial parent is probably the one who's contributing more of the student's living expenses. So I think that as a practical matter, it's likely to stay the custodial parent in most cases. Another change for the FAFSA. College payments by relatives will no longer count as student income. Now, I was just explaining that you might want to wait until after January 1st of the sophomore year for those relatives to make those payments. I think that that's going to continue to be the case, because even though the FAFSA is no longer going to continue to count those as income for the student, I believe that profile colleges almost certainly will continue to count payments by relatives as student income. So those profile colleges tend to be more generous, so be sure to keep that in mind. And as we said, the discount for having multiple siblings in college simultaneously is being eliminated for the FAFSA. So what's going to be the impact of these changes? Well, very needy students are going to benefit. It's going to make the FAFSA easier to fill out, and most of the financial changes will either be neutral or beneficial to very needy students. For middle-income students or middle-income families, it's less clear. And a crucial question is what's going to happen to the CSS profile. The reason that that's important is because the most generous need-based aid comes from profile colleges. And at those colleges, the maximum annual aid based on the FAFSA is about $7,000 to $10,000, where the maximum aid based on the profile could be as much as $70,000. So you can see that the stakes are much higher for profile aid. Another reason why the profile is going to be more important is because many colleges that don't use the profile leave a gap. That means that a student might have financial need, but they don't meet that full need. There's a gap between the amount of the need and what the college offers. So these are my educated guesses as to how the profile is going to react to some of these FAFSA changes. I think the profile is probably going to conform to the FAFSA in defining who's the custodial parent. But that's really not going to make that much of a practical difference because the profile typically is looking at both the custodial and non-custodial parent anyway. I think that the profile almost certainly will continue to count payments by relatives, grandparents, or family friends as income to the student. So I think that the timing of those payments could still continue to be important at colleges that use the CSS profile. And I think that profile colleges are going to continue to use a discount if there are multiple siblings in college at the same time. Now that discount is less generous than the FAFSA discount used to be, but I do think that there's going to be a continuation of that discount when there are multiple siblings in college. So the bottom line is, don't make a lot of changes for financial aid unless they make sense for your overall financial plan. That's true as it relates to these FAFSA changes, and really it's true about anything that you might do to impact your EFC. Don't do anything crazy to lower your EFC for financial aid if it's not also consistent with your overall financial planning interests. All right, so we've been talking about defining the student's profile so far, and this is the profile in terms of eligibility for need-based aid. Let's say that your student has financial need and you'd like to identify some colleges that might meet that need when you're looking for colleges to apply to. Well, when you're thinking about how colleges meet need, there are three things they can do. They can meet some of that need with a grant or gift aid. They can meet some of that need with loans or a job, self-help, or they can fail to meet that need. They leave a gap. So at the University of Maine and the University of New Hampshire, the average grant is 36 at UNH, 45% at University of Maine. So in other words, 45% of need is made up with a grant at University of Maine. The gap at the University of Maine is about 30%. It's about 32% at UNH. Now, the University of Maine is still likely to be affordable for Maine residents, but that's because of the lower starting cost for in-state students, not because of a really generous need-based aid program. At NYU and Ohio Wesleyan, they meet 60 to 70% of need with gift aid, and the gap is 29% at NYU and 17% at Ohio Wesleyan. At BU and Colby College, they meet even a higher percent need with gift aid, and Colby is one of the gold standards of colleges in terms of meeting a gift aid. Colby has no gap, they meet 100% of need, and they meet 97% of that need with gift aid. So if your student is eligible for need-based aid, Colby might be a good bet in terms of meeting the need. Of course, Colby is a very selective college, so it's not easy to get into Colby, but it is one that is very generous in terms of meeting need-based aid. So let's say that you have found that your student has some financial need and you found some colleges that might meet that need. Will the need-based aid make college affordable? So I want to show you an example of a really generous full need college. This is a college that uses the profile and they meet 100% of need as defined by the profile EFC. So for this example, we're going to say that the cost is $72,000 and the EFC is 30,000. That leaves 42,000 in need, and the college is going to meet 100% of it. However, they're going to meet the first $4,500 with a loan, the next $2,200 with work study, and only after loans and work study have been awarded will they start awarding gift aid. And in the end, it's going to be about 35,000 of gift aid. So when you subtract that gift aid from the starting cost, it turns out that the net price at this college is about $37,000, or $7,000 more than the EFC. This pattern continues in years 2, 3, and 4 of college. And by the end of 4 years of college, this college has met full financial need with a combination of loans, grants, and work study. The cumulative EFC has been 120,000, but the cumulative cost is 153,000, so significantly more than that EFC. Remember, this is a generous college and it doesn't include inflation in this example. So the rule of thumb that I suggest you use when you're thinking about whether need-based aid will make college affordable is to take your EFC, multiply it by 4, and then add about $40,000. If your EFC is 40,000 times 4, that's 160, plus 40 makes 200,000. If 200,000 is not affordable for 4 years of college, then need-based aid may not be the answer. So if need-based aid won't be the answer, how else might you get financial aid to pay for college? That's where we want to talk about merit aid. And to talk about merit aid, we need to start first with the business of college, because colleges fundamentally are businesses. They need to generate revenue in order to pay the costs of their faculty, staff, maintaining the grounds, buildings, and so on. So when people think about college, families tend to focus on the acceptance rate. That's the percent of students who apply to a college and are offered admission. At Harvard, it's about 4%. Northeastern and BU are 20%. Ohio Wesleyan and Susquehanna are more than 70%. Well, colleges pay attention to the admit rate, but they also look at another number, which is the yield rate. The yield rate is the percent of students who were offered admission in the spring and who end up enrolling at that college in the fall. So at Harvard, more than 4 out of 5 students who are offered admission to Harvard end up going to Harvard. At Northeastern and BU, about 1/4 of the students who are offered admission end up going to those schools. And at Ohio Wesleyan and Susquehanna, less than 15% of the students who are offered admission end up going. Well, when that yield rate gets into the 20s and less, colleges really worry about whether they're going to have enough students paying some tuition to generate the revenue that they need to pay their bill. So what do? They put themselves on sale. They discount their prices with financial aid to compete for yield. So this third column shows the percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid at each of these schools. Now, the gift aid might be need-based aid or it might be merit aid, but the key thing is that this is the percent of students who are receiving college-funded gift aid at these schools. And you can see at Ohio Wesleyan, 100% of the students are receiving some type of gift aid from the college. At Muhlenberg and Susquehanna, 96%. The final column, the fourth column, shows the percent of students who had no financial need but received some gift aid from these colleges. At Harvard and Wesleyan, they used no merit aid whatsoever. 0 students received any merit aid. But at some of these other colleges, more than 20 or 30% of the students who had no financial need received college-funded gift aid. So what this tells you is that merit aid is an important part of the aid awarding approach at many colleges. So let's dig into this a little bit and think about how to define your student's profile and how to find colleges where your student might get merit aid. So we said that merit aid is typically called scholarships. It is based on factors like grades, class rank, test scores, recommendations, and so on. Now, many colleges have gone test optional over the last few years. Don't worry if your student is applying test optional, because colleges are continuing to use a lot of merit aid. They'll put greater emphasis on the GPA in that case, and it may make it a little bit more difficult to predict the amount of merit aid, but there's a good chance that if a college uses merit aid, your student can get some. Now, merit aid is most prevalent at private colleges, but more and more public colleges are using it too. And here's a key point. The highest award go to the strongest students relative to the other applicants at that school. What that means is that your highest merit aid might come at colleges that you think of as your safety schools. So your safety schools for admission may also turn out to be your safety schools for financial aid. And college aid policies vary. As we saw, Harvard and Wesleyan use no merit aid. Other colleges use significant amounts of merit aid. So I want to show you some examples of how colleges award merit aid. And I'm using numbers from before the pandemic because during the time before the pandemic, SAT scores were much more readily available, and it's easy to see the relationship between merit aid and test scores by using them. So at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania, their highest merit award of $32,000 a year went to students with a combined SAT of 1450. It turns out that the 75th percentile SAT score at Gettysburg was 1410. What that means is that 25% of the students at Gettysburg scored 1410 or higher on their SAT. The lower merit award of $24,000 went to students with a 1300 SAT. And once again, you can see that that's pretty close to the college's 25th percentile of 1280. That means that 25% of the students at Gettysburg scored lower than 1280 on their SAT. And you can see that there's a similar pattern at the University of Tampa and Eckerd. Well, it turns out that you can make a pretty good generalization from that pattern. And here's the generalization. If a college uses merit aid, the best chances for the largest awards are when you're above the college's 75th percentile. If a college uses merit aid, the awards may phase out when you get to about the college's 25th percentile. But at colleges that compete aggressively for students, they may award merit aid to just about everyone who they admit to their college. So which colleges award merit aid? This is a great source of data. It's called College Navigator. I use it all the time. And what I'm looking at here is that percent of students who receive college-funded gift aid. At Gettysburg, it's 94%. At Washington College in Maryland, it's 99%. So here's the takeaway that you can use as a rule of thumb by looking at this percent of students who receive college-funded gift aid. If that percent is over 65 or 70%, it's pretty likely that the college uses merit aid as part of the way it awards aid. If it's over 80%, it's highly, highly likely that the college uses merit aid. And when you look at different colleges, you're going to find that that percentage is well above 90% at many, many colleges, which means that there are a lot of colleges that would love to offer your student merit scholarships if they apply. So where might you get merit aid? Well, I want to show you an example of a student who's got an 1180 SAT that's equivalent to an ACT of 24. Now, before the pandemic, I would have looked at the 75th percentile and higher to get a sense of where to look for merit aid. But now what I look at is someone who's in that middle 50%, because with the pandemic and fewer colleges requiring SAT scores, that has skewed average SAT scores higher. The reason is that students who are applying who have low SAT scores don't send them. Students who have high SAT scores do. That tends to pull the average up. So for this student with an 1180 SAT, they might look at Shenandoah University in Virginia, where the 75th percentile is 1260. That student with an 1180 is solidly in the middle, likely to qualify for a pretty good merit award at Shenandoah. And then you can look at other colleges with similar SAT or ACT scores to find other candidates where this student with that 1180 SAT might be a candidate to get some of the better merit awards. Another place you can look is called the Common Data Set. Now, this is not as user-friendly, unfortunately. The way to use this is to Google whatever college name you're interested in, and then the words Common Data Set. Then you want to go to section H, subsection 2A, and look at data elements N and O. N is the number of students, of first-year students who received gift aid without having any financial need. So that's merit aid. This happens to be Hofstra. So at Hofstra, 372 students got gift aid without having any need. That's about a quarter of the incoming class. And the average amount was about $24,000. Now, Hofstra has a starting cost of $70,000 or more. If you subtract that average merit award of $24,000, that puts you in the mid-50s if your student were to get an average merit award. So that gives you an idea of what you might end up with as a price at that school. Here are some examples of how colleges award merit aid. I'm going to show you at first a few private colleges. So at BU, only about 53% of students receive college-funded gift aid. Only 7% of students without financial need receive merit aid. So BU is probably not going to be a great candidate for getting aid if you're looking for merit aid. On the other hand, McAllister and Dickinson, which are pretty selective small liberal arts colleges, they use a significant amount of merit aid. Fordham and the College of Worcester use even more. And you can see at public colleges, some of them are using more and more merit aid. At UC Berkeley, plan to pay the full price. They give hardly any aid of any type to out-of-state students. So if your student is dead set on Berkeley, plan to pay $71,000 a year. But at the University of Maryland or URI, you might get some merit aid. And at Arizona State or University of Maine, there's a very good chance that you'll get some merit aid. Here's what you want to remember when you're thinking about merit aid. When a college has a relatively high admit rate, a relatively low yield rate, relatively high percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid, and the applicant is strong relative to other students at that college, that's going to be a candidate for merit aid for your student. So this is a summary of how colleges award need and merit aid. And I've broken colleges down into 4 categories that I call the elite, the near elite, the mid-market, and other. The elite and the near elite colleges are ones that you've heard of. They tend to have very generous need-based aid programs. They often guarantee to meet full financial need as they define it, and they often meet nearly all of that need with gift aid. On the other hand, those are the colleges that use very little or no merit aid. There are probably about 100, 125, maybe 150 of those colleges. On the other hand, the mid-market and other colleges don't have as generous need-based aid programs. Often they have a gap, often a sizable gap between the amount of need that a student has and the amount of aid that they offer. However, many of those colleges use a significant amount of merit aid. And it turns out that there are over 2,000 of these colleges in the US. So there are a lot of colleges that are dying to offer your student some merit aid if only your student will look. And what they're doing is trying to attract your student to their college by competing on price compared to other schools. All right, so we talked about need-based aid, we talked about merit aid. Now let's talk about how to estimate your net price. And the way to do that is to use a tool called a net price calculator. Net price calculators have been required by law since 2011. Every college has to have one, and it needs to give an estimate of the starting cost, that cost of attendance, an estimate of the amount of gift aid that your student might receive, and what the difference is, or the net price. Now, all colleges are required to have a net price calculator, but they are not required to have good ones. Here's how you can tell. If a net price calculator asks 5 or 6 questions, super easy to use, you can do it in 10 seconds or so, it stinks. If it asks a lot of questions, it goes into a lot of detail, it's probably asking for enough information to give you a fairly reliable estimate of what your net price might be. And when you're using them, remember, cost of attendance minus gift aid equals the net price. Now, another problem that some people have with net price calculators, especially if you're not really comfortable with numbers, is that the outputs can be kind of intimidating. They're heavy with numbers. In those cases, go back to the basics. Remember, net price is cost of attendance minus gift aid. Cost of attendance is always made up of those 4 elements: tuition and fees, room and board, books and supplies, transportation and other miscellaneous expenses. Subtract the amount of gift aid, and the result is the net price. Now, when you go to net price calculators, what you're going to be able to do is to compare the net price of different colleges that your student is considering side by side. Now, here's where I want to pause, because we've been talking about dollars and cents this evening. But you also want to be thinking about your students' academic preferences. What type of college environment is going to allow your student to thrive and make the most of his or her college years? So I'm not necessarily advocating that you find the cheapest college for your student. What I am advocating, though, is that when you find a college, you make sure it's affordable so that at the end of 4 years of college, both the parents and the student are in a good position to move on with the rest of their lives. Okay, so I want to show you an example of comparing the net price for a student with a 15,000 EFC, B- to B grades, and an 1100 SAT. It turns out that at Roger Williams College in Rhode Island, the cost of attendance is $60,000. This student is likely to get a $13,000 merit award, an additional $6,000 in need-based aid, for a net price of $41,000. At Shenandoah, the net price is going to be $37,000. It'll be $29,000 at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, $23,000 at Orono, $18,000 at Bowdoin That's really great. That's only a few thousand more than the EFC. Or at the University of Southern Maine, commuting to college and living with his or her parents, the net price is going to be about $10,000. Now, a couple of things that I should mention. A B student is not going to get into Bowdoin. So unfortunately, that fabulous net price probably is not going to be accessible for this student. So you want to think about the student's overall profile as you're looking at net prices. Another thing, I know that commuting to USM while living with your family is not the same thing as going away to college and living in the dorm. The reason, though, that I put that example on here is to remind people that there is an affordable path to college for everyone. And the purpose of college is to set the student up for success after college without taking on crippling debt. So if the only way to get the benefit of a college education is to commute to USM, far better to do that for 4 years of college than to be saddled with crippling debt for decades after college. Okay, we're on the downhill side. We're almost done with the formal part of the presentation, but I want to talk for a couple of minutes about paying the net price. Now, one thing that people sometimes say is, well, this is great, but what we're going to do is we're going to apply for scholarships and we're going to use that to pay the net price. Unfortunately, that is unlikely to work because the vast majority of gift aid comes from colleges themselves in the form of the need and merit aid that we've been talking about tonight. Getting significant outside scholarship aid that's really going to make a difference in how much you pay for college is very rare. So it's fine to apply for these outside scholarships. My advice is to find a college where the net price is affordable without outside scholarships. Then the outside scholarships are just going to make it that much better. So when you come to that final net price, the way you're going to pay for that is from income that you've earned over time. What do I mean by that? Well, there are 3 sources of income. The first is prior income, money that you've earned in the past and saved. The second is current income, money that you earned during the college years and are able to use to pay for college expenses. And the third type of income is future income, money that you earn after college and use to repay loans with principal and interest. This is always the most expensive way to pay for college. But these are the only ways, these are the 3 sources of money to pay for college. So, is the net price going to be affordable? Well, remember at the beginning, we looked at that award letter and the net price for that student for 1 year was $34,865. We've got to remember that the cost of college is going to be for 4 years if you're looking for a bachelor's degree. So there are a couple of important questions to ask. 1, how much are the costs going to increase? And very importantly, is the aid automatically renewable and on what terms? Now, it turns out that most merit aid is renewable as long as the student maintains a minimum GPA during college. Most need-based aid is renewable as long as the family's income and assets remain pretty consistent over the course of college. But if it is not crystal clear to you exactly what's required to renew each element of aid on that financial aid notification, you want to go back to the college and make sure that they clarify it for you. So for this example, we're going to assume that costs increase 2% per year, that aid is renewable and constant for 4 years, that the student has $2,000 in savings and the parents have $25,000. Let's see how we pay for that college. That $35,000 a year college with inflation in 4 years is going to cost $145,000 for the degree. I'm going to look first at the student. The student was offered a work-study job of $1,800 a year, and the student was offered federal student loans. Federal student loans are always the first place to look if you're going to borrow for college, because they're automatically available as long as you file the FAFSA. The interest rate is reasonable for an unsecured loan, and there are protections in place if the borrower runs into trouble after college. But there's a maximum amount you can borrow, and that maximum amount is $5,500 in year one, $6,500 in year two, and then $7,500 each in years 3 and 4. Next, we said that this student has $2,000 in savings. I'm going to use those first to pay for college, because remember, student assets count more heavily in the EFC formula than parent assets. So if I use those student assets first, maybe there's a possibility that there might be a little bit more eligibility for need-based aid in years 2, 3, and 4. Next, I'm going to assume that the student gets a summer job each year before college. If the student gets a job that pays $10 an hour for 40 hours a week for 10 weeks in the summer, he or she is going to earn $4,000, pay taxes, go to the beach or the movies, but they can still save $2,000 to use toward college expenses. At this point, the student resources are exhausted. Now we've got to start looking to the parents to help pay for the balance of college. This family is going to look at their budget, and the parents are going to say, okay, we think we can contribute $375 a month out of our ongoing income to pay for college. That turns out to be about $4,500 a year. Next, we're going to use $19,000 of the parent savings, and that will fully pay for year one of college. In year two, we're going to use the balance of the savings. It's about almost $6,000. But at this point, the parent resources are exhausted. The only way to pay for additional college is additional borrowing. And I always consider additional borrowing to be a parent responsibility, because at a minimum, the parents are either going to be required to borrow the money directly or to co-sign for a private student loan. In this case, the amount that needs to be borrowed to fully pay for year two is $15,000, an additional $21,000 in borrowing to pay for year three, and $22,000 to pay for year four. So the good news is that we have fully paid for this college using prior income, current income, and future income. We've ended up with $27,000 in student debt and $58,000 in parent debt. Is that amount of debt reasonable? We don't know yet. There are some questions that we need to ask. The first one is, what will federal loans cost? It turns out that the current interest rate on student loans is about 5%, and on parent loans, it's about 7.5%. And you pay those loans off over 10 years, beginning 6 months after graduation. In addition to that, you have to keep in mind that the interest clock starts ticking the moment you take those loans out. So for every $1,000 of student debt, about $136 of interest is going to accumulate over the course of the 4 years of college before it goes into repayment. When it does go into repayment, for every $1,000 of debt, the student is going to have to pay back $127 per year for 10 years to pay it off. For every $1,000 of parent debt, the parents are going to need to pay about $143 a year. So if the student borrows the maximum $27,000 in federal student loans, the student is going to have about $3,500 of additional interest that's going to accumulate during the 4 years of college. It's going to be added to the beginning balance of that loan. That's called capitalized interest. So the student is going to start repayment with $30,530 of debt. That's going to require annual payments of about $3,900 a year. 127 times 30.5 is $3,884. The parents are going to have $9,300 in capitalized interest, and their annual payment is going to be about $9,600. So that's how much it's going to cost. Is it reasonable? My rule of thumb is that payments for education debt should not exceed about 10% of the student's gross income. That's going to leave 90% of income to pay taxes, rent, and what I call the 3 Gs, gas, groceries, and good times. So let's take a look. That student borrowed $27,000 with capitalized interest. He or she has $30,530 in debt. It's going to require about $3,900 in annual payments. If the student gets a job after college that pays $39,000 a year, that student is going to have 90% or more of his or her income for all of the other things, 10% or less for education repayments. And the good news is that the average starting salaries for new college graduates are about $40,000 to $50,000. So I'm not too concerned about the student taking on that $27,000 in debt in order to get the benefit of a college degree. For the parents, it's more complicated because they've got to consider their ongoing obligations, college for other children, and retirement. And in this case, I see a big red flag. Remember, when we were talking with the parents about their budget, they said they could pay $375 a month or $4,500 a year for college. So my question to them is going to be, if you can only afford $4,500 a year during college, what makes you think you can pay $9,600 a year after college? So in my mind, this college is not affordable at this price for this family. So how does everyone else pay? Exactly like we've been talking about tonight. You find out what your true cost of college is by starting with the cost of attendance, subtracting the gift aid. That's going to be the net price. You add up the resources that you have available to pay for college. I think every student can automatically come up with about $43,000. That's $27,000 in federal student loans, $2,000 a year in work study, and $2,000 a year in summer job earnings. We don't know what the parents have, but the total is going to be the resources that are available to pay for college. If those resources don't equal the net price, the only way to fill that gap is either to take on more debt or to find a different college with a lower net price. So when I work with families, what I encourage them to do is to identify what I call their zone of affordability. That's the maximum price that they can pay for a 4-year degree, and every college that comes in less than that price is going to be in that zone of affordability. My default is to suggest that families identify the parent debt-free point. That's the point at which the student might have a reasonable amount of debt, but the parents have no debt after college. Here's a chart that I find helpful in thinking about the resources that are available to pay for college. So think about the prior income or savings, current income, and future income for the student and the parents. We know the student's got about $43,000 available. Think about what the student and the parents have in savings, what the parents can afford to pay out of their ongoing income, and do not include any debt. That's going to equal the parent debt-free point. So this is pretty heavy stuff. And a lot of people feel a little discouraged after they've heard it. Think about it as the stages of grief. And I would much rather have you go through the stages of grief before taking on unsustainable debt than after. Another thing to keep in mind, college is important, but it's not the goal. The goal is to set the student up for success in life after college without either the student or the parents taking on excessive debt. Another item of perspective is to think about Howard Schultz, the guy who built Starbucks into a huge company, or Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, or Michelle Buck, the CEO of Hershey Foods. These people went to colleges that you probably have not heard of. They might not be on your radar, but they have done very well in life. So you don't need to go to a big brand name college to have success after college. Another way to look at it, think about the mid-career earnings of graduates of Colorado College, Connecticut College, and Allegheny College. It turns out that those mid-career earnings are almost identical. They differ by only $1,200 a year. But the difference in the net price for 4 years at these colleges is over $100,000. So how can you find financial safeties? Well, one way is to use the numbers that we've been talking about tonight. Another way, if you're not totally comfortable with that, is to seed your list. And by that, I mean put in colleges that will automatically have different approaches to awarding aid. And it's likely that some of them will be a match for your student's profile. So a public in-state college is almost always affordable. Maybe an out-of-state public flagship. Secondary out-of-state publics are often much less expensive than the flagship colleges. If your student has high need, those highly selective private colleges could be a good bet. And if you're looking for merit aid, there's a website, CTCL, Colleges That Change Lives. Those often use a significant amount of merit aid. Finally, if you are a Maine resident, you can get free money from FAME, about $300 a year, by contributing $1,000 to a FAME 529 account. If you're from out of state, look into whether there are opportunities that your state agency might offer to help save for college. So I want to thank you all for joining tonight. I've got a website that has links to resources. And if anyone is interested, I'd be happy to send the slides from the presentation and a copy of the recording. Just send me an email.